Okay, thank you very much. And I'm very honored by the invitation and also very excited to present this work today. So this is joint work with Cecilia Balocchi, who's also at the University of Edinburgh with me. Here we go. So this is a roadmap of what I've talked about. I'm just going to start with a very brief intro into the challenges of understanding posteriors in Bayesian nonparametrics. And then I'm going to focus in the context of clustering. So we have a posterior with space of partitions. And I'll talk about the challenges and existing approaches to summarizing the posterior. Then I'll talk about our proposal, which is to quantify the uncertainty via a suitable approximation of the posterior. And then we've developed some different recommendations or tools to visualize the uncertainty provided by this approximation. And then we've conducted a number of different synthetic experiments which highlight when these tools are useful, so very practical settings when we have components or clusters that are not well separated or our model might be misspecified. And lastly, hopefully I'll have time, I'll talk a little bit about an ongoing project where we're using clustering to identify neural projection patterns from a type of single-cell sequencing data. Okay, so everyone here, we love Bayesian nonparametric models for the flexibility that they provide, but they result in posterior distributions over complex high-dimensional spaces that can be difficult to interpret and describe. So we've seen a lot of nice talks so far, and we'll see more talks where people have carefully constructed models and priors in these complex high-dimensional spaces. And they've also carefully designed the inference algorithms to effectively explore these spaces. But often there's a lack of tools to effectively describe and visualize the posterior in these non-standard settings. And we also all love the Bayesian approach for the additional uncertainty that it provides. So we need tools not only to get a point estimate of the parameters in this non-standard setting, but we also want to have some way to understand the uncertainty provided by the posterior. So I'm going to focus on the context of clustering. So my posterior is defined on the space of partitions, but I think the tools that I'll be talking about can be extended to other settings as well. So I'm happy to talk after this if anybody has some other interesting ideas too. Okay, so this is the general setup that we're working in. We have a posterior defined on the space of partitions. So Y is my observed data. I have n data points. These could be of general type. Rho represents my partition of my data points into k groups. And we have, of course, our likelihood component. Maria talked about different types of likelihoods we could use. And we've seen other talks about this as well. We could also use a generalized Bayes approach. So this could be defined based on some loss function. And then we also have the prior. So we're going to focus on priors that account also for our uncertainty in the unknown number of clusters as well. Okay, and then we combine these two ingredients as usual through Bayes rule or some generalized version of it. So we get our posterior distribution. And we can think of, we have this big ensemble of many, many different clustering solutions. Okay, so again, we want to account for the fact that we're uncertain in the number of clusters. So we might be using one of these approaches, a mixture of finite mixtures, overfitted sparse mixtures, or for this audience, we can use the infinite Bayesian nonparametric mixtures as well. Okay, so this is the framework that we're focusing on. So now you've carefully constructed your model, your prior. How do you actually compute that posterior that we saw on that slide? So we can't actually compute that posterior because the dimension of this space is too big. So in the non-parametric setting, we have a Bell number of possible partitions. And for 10 data points, this is already around 116,000. This quickly blows up as n increases. So typically, we often use Markov chain Monte Carlo for inference. We could use other algorithms as well. Here I'm going to focus on Markov chain Monte Carlo, but everything will also be applicable if you're using things like importance sampling, sequential Monte Carlo, posterior bootstrap, and so on. So suppose we run our MCMC algorithm, and we get in the order of tens of thousands of different clustering solutions. They all represent draws from the posterior. Because this space is so big, most of them are unique. They suffer from the label switching problem, and they'll also vary in the number of clusters as well. Okay, so we carefully constructed our model. We carefully constructed our algorithm. Now what do we do with these 10,000 different clustering solutions? So if we were in the kind of nice Euclidean space, we typically report our posterior mean and some credible intervals. But of course, this is what the space that we're working with looks like. So we can represent this partition space with this Hasse diagram. So at the top, I have the greatest element of that set that's putting all my data points in one cluster. Here, for illustration, we just have 4 data points. Then we have the least element of the set, which is splitting everything into all singletons. And these lines represent the relation defined by set containment. So we draw a line from one partition down to another if it's obtained by splitting one of its clusters into 2. Okay, so we want some way to define this notion of a representative mean and some representation of uncertainty in this non-standard space. And another interesting thing to think about is that we know if we were in a nice Euclidean space and we plotted our posterior and we calculated our posterior mean, it wouldn't be representative in this context. So what if we actually did all the work to come up with a nice point estimate of our clustering in this setting, and it's not even representative because the posterior is multimodal? And how do we even understand if our posterior is multimodal when we're in this non-standard setting? Okay, so before I answer this question, let's look at what available tools we have to summarize the posterior over this space of partitions. So first, let's focus on finding that red line, that single point estimate clustering solution that summarizes all those 10,000 different draws. So one thing we can do is we can report the map partition. Another thing we can do is we can compute our posterior similarity matrix. So this is an n by n matrix where each element represents the probability that 2 data points are co-clustered. We could input this into another hierarchical or partitioning algorithm to get out a clustering solution. A more natural approach from a Bayesian perspective is to do use a decision theoretic framework and report the estimator that minimizes the posterior expected loss. So now we need to choose a loss function. We could choose, for example, the 0,1 loss that gives us back the map partition, or we could use some loss functions that are more specific to the context of partitions. So for example, we can use Binder's loss, 1 minus the adjusted rand index, and in our paper we proposed using the variation of information loss. Okay, so I'll call the min VI, for example, our optimal clustering solution that we get out by minimizing the posterior expected variation of information. Okay, so that's all about getting that red line, but the advantage of the Bayesian approach is that we also have this uncertainty over this space of partitions. So we also want some tools to describe that uncertainty. And one thing we can do is we can visualize that posterior similarity matrix. Another thing we can do that we proposed in this paper is, so both Binder's loss and the variation of information, they're metrics on the space of partitions. So we can use that to construct a credible ball in this space. And a one-line summary of what we're trying to do here is just to add another tool to our toolkit. So we want to report not just a single estimate, but a small number of multiple point estimates to describe the uncertainty. Okay, so before I get into that, let me just say a little bit more about the loss functions. So binder's loss and variation of information, they're both metrics on the space of partitions. So the distance between two partitions, say row and row hat, for both of these distances, they can be written as a function of these contingency counts here. So this counts the number of data points that are in cluster J in row hat and are also in cluster K in row. So binder's loss is a quadratic function of these counts, whereas the variation of information just replaces that quadratic function with x log x. Okay, so why might we want to use the variation of information over binder's loss? So we looked at a few different properties here. I'll just put up a simple one to illustrate why. So 1 here denotes that greatest element of the set, that's everybody clustered together, and 0 represents the least element of the set, that's all singleton clusters. Okay, and now let row K denote the partition of my data points into K clusters of equal size. So what this is saying is that under binder's loss, it's always better to estimate row K with all singletons than to merge them into one large cluster. And this holds for any choice of K and N. So even, for example, if K is equal to 2, it's always better to estimate with all singletons than to merge these into one cluster. And the variation of information instead is much more symmetric in this regard. So let me show you an example of the consequences of this when we use this as a loss function to get our point estimate. So this is a very simple kind of boring example. The data are just generated from a standard normal 1D setting, but it's interesting because Jeff is here. I don't know if he's here, but he's at the conference. So this was one of the examples that he studied in his 2013 paper, where he showed that the Dirichlet process mixture is inconsistent for the number of clusters. Okay, so what he actually showed is the summary that he was focusing on was the marginal posterior on the number of clusters. And he showed that the probability that K is equal to 1 goes to 0 as N goes to infinity. And there were several papers after that that looked at other models beyond the Dirichlet process. And this one in particular showed that under different conditions, we can actually achieve consistency if we adapt the parameter of the Dirichlet process appropriately. Okay, so that's focusing on one summary, just marginally looking at the number of clusters. Instead, if we focus on the map partition as our summary, we have consistency regardless of the choice of alpha. And here I'll show you, at least empirically, that binder's loss, we can get a gross overestimation of the number of clusters. So in this picture here, this is data is generated from the same mechanism, just a standard normal distribution. And I've used a Dirichlet process mixture model, same MCMC samples. All I'm doing is comparing different ways of summarizing those MCMC samples. And the main takeaway is that how I summarize those samples can change my conclusions and results quite drastically. So if I focus on that marginal posterior, on the number of clusters, if I don't tune that parameter appropriately, I can get this overestimation of the number of clusters, and it can get worse as N increases. Instead, if I focus on the map partition, I recover the true one cluster solution regardless of how I chose alpha, which is what Rakowski showed. Also, for the variation of information, I have the same behavior. And for binder's loss, if I didn't choose alpha well, it might be hard to see in the back here, but essentially it's estimating with all singletons in that case. So it's kind of can clearly blow up with the number of data points. Okay, so let's look at another example. This was another example that Rakowski studied in his paper when he was looking at properties of the map partition. And here he considered an example where I have a slightly bimodal example. So I have two components that are not well separated. So this is the true density, and you can barely see the two modes, but from the histogram, it might not be so obvious. And here, if I look at the map partition, he showed that it will just contain one cluster. Also, the min vi, empirically, we find also just contains one cluster. If I use other loss functions instead, I get two clusters. So I have, again, this disagreement depending on which loss function I use or how I choose to summarize the posterior. And if I look at the posterior similarity matrix, I do see that there maybe could be two clusters, but there's not this clear separation between the groups. So if we dig into this posterior a little bit more carefully, we actually see there's evidence of multimodality in this posterior. So here, each dot represents a partition, an MCMC sample, a clustering, and I've colored it by the number of clusters in that partition, and then for some of them, I've reported the cluster sizes as well. So at the top here, the y-axis shows the log posterior relative to the map, and the x-axis is the VI distance to the map. So remember, the map is everybody in one cluster. So there's the map at the top, and if I split off one single point, so there are actually 500 dots up there at the top, I decrease my posterior a little bit and I move a bit further from the map. And then I start to split off more and more and more. The posterior decreases. But then when I go up to two clusters of equal size, the posterior starts to increase again. Okay, so to capture this multimodality in the posterior, we propose to summarize the posterior, not with just a single point estimate, but a small number of multiple partitions. And we're going to do this by approximating the posterior with some distribution Q on the space of partitions that's only supported on a small number L of partitions, which we'll call our particles. And so each of those partitions also has weight attached to it as well. Okay, and we propose to find this Q by minimizing the Wasserstein distance equipped with some metric on the space of partitions. So here we're going to focus on the VI distance, that this could be extended to using other choices as well. So now we want to find the weights and the particles that minimize the Wasserstein distance. This is just the definition of the Wasserstein distance. And J here represents a coupling, so it's just a bivariate distribution over the space of partitions with marginals given by P and Q. And this Wasserstein distance evaluated at the optimal Q star, we can think of this as measuring the minimal amount of uncertainty that we lose when summarizing with L partitions. Okay, so we came up with a cool name, Wasabi, the Wasserstein approximation for Bayesian clustering. I thought David Dahl is here. I thought it went well with salsa. So if L is equal to 1, Q is just a point mass on one partition. And it's quite easy to show that the Wasserstein distance, in this case, just reduces to the expected VI distance. So my optimal particle in this sense is just the min VI. And again, I can think of the Wasserstein distance evaluated at the optimal Q in this case, and that's just the expected VI distance. That's the amount of uncertainty that I lose when I summarize with a single particle. Or we can also think of it as measuring the spread around in the posterior around that optimal partition. Okay, so now in the general case, we can find Q as follows. So if we look at this problem, if we minimize with respect to W and J, we can get the optimal form for the coupling. This is the optimal form for the coupling. Essentially, you just want to assign that partition's mass to the closest particle. So now these NLs, we define these as the region of attraction or the neighborhood of that particle. That's the set of partitions that are closest to the nth particle. And the weights is just the posterior mass of that region. So now all I need to do is find the set of particles that minimize the expected VI distance within that region of attraction. And I can find a local solution to this problem by essentially doing a k-means or a k-metoids-like algorithm, but abstracted to this space of partitions. So we're just doing clustering. Yes?
Just clarification. So if L is equal to 1, does that mean that there's a unique solution? Or
yes. Yeah. It's just the min VI partition.
You're going to have multiple solutions at the same distance.
Yes, it is unique here, this min VI partition. Okay. I think I said everything on the previous slide. So now in practice, what we have is the access to the MCMC samples, not the true posterior. So everything we saw before, we can just plug in our empirical posterior given by the MCMC sample. So we're clustering the MCMC samples of partitions. So I have a little diagram to illustrate how this works. So just squint your eyes a little bit and imagine that this is that Hasse diagram in many dimensions. So each dot is supposed to represent a partition, and these lines are representing that covering relation, and suppose that this is what that posterior looks like. First question, why should we use the Wasserstein distance? Why not use the KL divergence? So Cecilia and Samir, who also might be here, so they looked at this in some previous work, and they showed that the optimal set of particles in this sense are the top L map partitions. Okay, so in this context, with the top map partitions, we get these partitions that are very, very close to each other. We wouldn't characterize this other mode at all. So it only characterizes very, very local uncertainty. And in this context, that's slightly bimodal example. Even if I took 501 partitions, my top map partitions would be everybody together and just splitting off one data point. So it doesn't really characterize the uncertainty. So instead, if I minimize the Wasserstein distance, what I'm trying to do is split this space into different regions and finding the min VI within each region. So I do capture these two modes in this space. And so how this works in practice is that what we have access to is not that full posterior, but we have some samples, which might be these blue dots here. And then we're essentially just applying a k-means or a k-metoids-like algorithm to this space. So given the optimal particles, each MCMC sample, we assign it to its region of attraction. So we figure out what's the closest particle, and then we use some algorithms that we have available to find the VI within each region. And now we have advanced search algorithms like David Dahl's Salso, so we can search outside of the space of MCMC samples as well. So this is essentially how the algorithm works. It looks like k-means, but on the space of partitions. We know that it only provides a local solution, so initialization is quite important. But the nice thing is there's lots of initialization strategies that have been developed for k-means, so we can abstract these ideas to this space as well. And as I mentioned, we can use some different algorithms. The package allows for different algorithms. The default Salso, but we have other algorithms as well to search for the min VI. And we also allow a mini batch option, so that's subsampling the MCMC samples to make it a bit faster as well. Another question, how do we choose the number of particles that we want to report? So here we're just simply proposing to look at the elbow plot to choose the number of particles. And the idea is that the more particles we take, the harder it becomes to describe, look at every single clustering solution and describe the differences. So we want L to be as small as possible, and we'll only increase L if we get a good drop in the Wasserstein distance. So for this case, we might say 2 particles seems to be enough. And indeed, when I look at these 2 particles, I do capture those 2 modes that we did see in the posterior. So I have the highest weight on the solution with just 1 cluster of 0.7, and then I have a weight around 0.3 for the particle where I use 2 clusters. And this 2 cluster solution is essentially just splitting the data, whether it's positive or negative. Okay, let's look at a slightly more, still simple example, but slightly more complicated. So we like to call this the flower example. So we have our 4 flower petals, but the petals are sort of overlapping a little bit. And we fit a Bayesian location scale mixture. This is what the posterior similarity matrix looks like. So some red, but also a lot of yellow, a lot of uncertainty as well that we could expect because there's a lot of overlap. So very interestingly here, this is what the min VI partition looks like. So it's finding this weird L-shaped cluster. And the reason it's doing this is because the posterior is multimodal, and we're getting this summary that isn't actually representative of the samples that we see. So I tried to illustrate this a bit here, but essentially the MCMC samples, we have lots of variants of things that look like this. So they're merging these components and these components. And then to kind of average these 2, this is why we're getting this weird clustering estimate. Okay, so instead, if we use the wasabi approximation, in this case we chose 3 particles. The first particle just contains a single cluster, so it says maybe there's not even any clusters in the data, but the next 2 do find 3 clusters. So that min VI partition is no longer there, that weird one. And those other two particles do capture those kind of 2 main modes that we see at emerging, the top 2 or the side 2. Okay, so am I doing okay on time? Yeah. So we've developed a bunch of different tools to visualize and describe the uncertainty provided by the posterior. So we can look at the weight and the number of clusters in each particle. We can plot the particles colored by their cluster membership. But to dig in and to compare a bit more carefully, we have proposed to investigate specific points that change their cluster assignment when we're comparing 2 particles by looking at the contribution of each point to the VI distance. So essentially, when I look at the VI distance between 2 particles, I can write this as a sum of non-negative terms, and each term we call the contribution of that data point to the VI distance. And so this will be 0 if that point is clustered with the same set of data points in the 2 partitions, and it will be high if it's changed, swapped a lot who it's clustered with. So if we compare the particle 2 and 3 that looked at these different ways of merging these components here, the points that have the highest contribution to the VI distance between these 2 particles are these ones on the boundary, so they've completely swapped from being with here to this cluster, and the most stable points are in this quadrant here. Another thing we can do is we can look at the posterior similarity matrix within each region of attraction. So that tells us how much variability there is within each region of attraction. We can also compute the EVI within each region of attraction. So that tells us how much spread there is within that region. So for example, for particle 1, we have the most yellow and the highest spread. And for particle 2, we have a bit more red and the lowest spread around that particle. We can also look at the meat of the particles. So this is the greatest lower bound. It's found by intersecting all the clusters. And this tells us which data points are always clustered together. So in this case, this is what the meat of the particles look like. We have these 4 quadrants and then some small clusters along the particle. And then based on our wasabi approximate posterior, we can also get posterior similarity matrix for each meat cluster, which tells us, that gives us an idea of the probability of merging some of these clusters. So for example, particle 2 merges 1, 4, and 5. These top 3 up here, and this gives us an idea of the probability of merging them across the wasabi approximation. Okay, and then the last tool that we've added is we can investigate points that are uncertain in their clustering assignment by looking at their contribution to the expected VI distance. Okay, so now if we're looking at a single clustering solution, we want to see for this clustering solution, how variable is assignment of an individual point compared to all the MCMC samples. Again, we can factorize this across data points and get the contribution of an individual data point. So if we look at that meat of the particles again, and we want to understand how uncertain is each data point in this cluster assignment compared to all the MCMC samples, we see the highest uncertainty again for these points along the border and the most stability for these points at the other ends of the quadrant. Okay, so we've carried out a bunch of different synthetic experiments to highlight when this is useful, particularly, so if we have a well-specified model and well-separated components, all we get, it tends to say just one particle is enough, so it's not super interesting. The more interesting case is when we have a well-specified model, but our components are not very well separated, or if we have a misspecified model as well, then we seem to get some interesting uncertainty in the posterior. So I don't have time to talk about the misspecified examples. I'll just talk briefly about the well-specified but not well-separated components. So we explored what happens in our flower example if we push our petals closer together or we pull our petals further apart. So when we push them very close together, it just estimates a single cluster because everything's overlapping. And when we pull them again very far apart, then it tends to estimate around 4 clusters. And this is looking at the EVI, so the spread in the posterior. And we have smaller spread when we have well-separated components, and then the spread increases precisely in this region where we do have some overlap. So there's more uncertainty in the clustering structure when there's overlap in the petals. And this is exactly the case. So this is the improvement of summarizing with a single particle compared to summarizing with 10 particles in this case. So we have the greatest improvement when we summarize with multiple particles, precisely when we're in this case where we have this some overlap in the components. Okay, so I have an example to finish up with. I don't think I have too much time to go into the data, the details of the data. This is part of a larger project with a number of collaborators, particularly led by Gulsen Sermelik, who's at the Center for Discovery Brain Sciences in Edinburgh. And so the data we have, essentially we have data at the level of individual neurons. And so for each neuron, this picture here is illustrating the process, the axons of the neuron. So this is how the individual neuron communicates to other parts of the brain and makes these long-range projections. So we have the axon and all the branches coming out. And what we don't observe this complicated branching process, but what we do observe is that for each individual neuron, we take tissue samples at different target sites of interest. And we essentially get a count that reflects the number of branches that terminate in that target region. So that's the strength of how much information that neuron sends to that target brain area. So this is what the data looks like. It's just a sparse count matrix. And so each row represents a neuron, and each column represents some of the target brain areas. And they actually carry out these experiments across multiple mice as well. So we have multiple copies of these sparse matrices. And we developed a model which we called HBMAP. It's just a hierarchical Bayesian mixture model that allows us to integrate this data across the multiple experiments as well. We're using a Dirichlet multinomial kernel to account for the count nature of the data. Okay, let me just go to the results because I just have a few minutes left. So this is we've looked at a number of different data sets. This is one data set, a subset of one data set that's looking at projections from the auditory cortex to a number of different brain regions. And this is what the posterior similarity matrix looks like for this data. So we can see the so the min VI here is illustrated by these bars, and it finds these 5 clusters. And if we use wasabi here to summarize this posterior, we've picked 4 particles. The first particle with highest weight looks very similar to this min VI partition. And just for illustration, I'm going to focus on the comparison of the first and the third particle. So this is what the first particle looks like. It captures these 5 main patterns in the way that these neurons communicate information to the brain. So at the top here, I've listed the names of each of the regions that the neurons are projecting to. And particle 3 is showing that maybe there is some uncertainty in kind of essentially it's splitting up this cluster into 2. So they have slightly different strengths in how they project, and pulling some from cluster 1 into this cluster as well. And also it pulls out some singleton clusters. So we know that there's some level of noise in this data. So maybe these are slightly more noisy neurons that we shouldn't rely on as much. Okay, so that was about everything that I wanted to say. One other interesting thing that I didn't talk about is that in addition to using this to understand the uncertainty, another thing we could use this for is for data compression, so compression of the posterior. So instead of saving all the MCMC samples, what if we just save this very much more lower dimensional summary of the MCMC sample? So that helps with both storage and it helps with computational costs of any predictive quantity. So if we want to do density estimation, conditional density estimation, this makes this much faster. Another thing that we want to do that we haven't done yet is play around with other choices of loss functions as well. And the last thing is, I think this could be quite useful to summarize posteriors in other non-standard settings as well. So some things we're thinking about now is variable selection and looking at trees, but maybe also networks. I don't work in networks, but anyone that works in networks and wants to discuss this as well. So that was everything. We just put up the paper and released the first version of the package. So any comments are welcome. So thank you very much.
Sara, for a nice talk about summarizing a very complex space. It's all important to us. There's some time for some questions. Excellent. We'll start with Alessandra.
Hi, Sara, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk, even if it's not the first time that I listen to this funny idea. So I like it very much as being Bayesian. I agree with you that we have to provide some uncertainty, though there are a couple of things that, well, not disturb me, but are more controversial. Well, first of all, I personally hate elbow plots because they're difficult. It's difficult to see the elbow. So we somehow want to avoid like the non-Bayesian. I mean, this is what I tell to my students. We don't resort to these funny things of the elbow. And so now there is the elbow back. And the other thing, so if there are, the question is, are other methods to fix L, the number of particles? And the other one is more practical. I mean, if I need to display my clustering to illustrate my results, my clustering to non-Bayesian statisticians or to scientists which are not statisticians. So how can I translate easily to them this idea of the particles? Thank you.
Yes, so thank you. I was waiting for you to pass the mic to me, but I remembered that I have a mic. Yeah, so certainly the elbow plot. I mean, I think here we're looking for something fast and cheap to summarize the posterior, but I mean, you could even be Bayesian on top of this to summarize the MCMC sample. So that is also something we could do. She also looked at using like a silhouette method, but it wasn't giving anything different or really interesting beyond just looking at the elbow plot. So for the second one, for communicating the particles, so we did spend a lot of time in developing these tools to summarize. That's why it's very helpful to keep the number of particles quite small, because the more you get, the harder it is to communicate with people and tell them about how there might be these different modes in summarizing the posterior. And I think that's just something that we need more practice with, more work with other collaborators to find out what is the best way to communicate, a bit of a trial and error. So in this case, with this data, I think they quite like these smaller number of clusters that we get in here, but it is helpful for them to see, okay, maybe there could be slightly more nuanced projection patterns in the data. But I think it's, yeah, a bit more work with discussing with them what is the best way to communicate.
Can you put the last line so I can take a picture of this paper? Thank you.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, really fantastic talk. I love this idea. So, yeah, maybe this relates to one of your last bullets, but it would seem like if you ran the MCMC, of course, and you have multiple modes, then you get stuck and things. And so also you could think of something like an alternative to a variational approximation where you were running an algorithm to target an optimization algorithm without sampling to target the minimal Wasserstein distance approximation to the posterior of the partitions. And then I think if you did that, and then potentially an extension of what you were doing would be, instead of having just like atoms on each of these points, what if you put like, say, uniform distributions around each of those atoms? You know, say one step up and down in the Hass diagram. And so you had like, and that was your approximation of the posterior, and then you defined an optimization algorithm to minimize the Wasserstein distance instead of the kind of KL that people very control. It seems like you could still do the Wasserstein minimization. I mean, just a discrete uniform around each of the points. So you're doing like trivial moves, changes like deleting, merging, or adding one point with around each atom.
Yeah, so that's a great idea. I mean, we could have small balls around instead of just a Q being a sum of point masses. We could have small balls around there as well. I would have to think about how that would affect the implementation. Obviously, that would come with some cost. And yeah, this is something that I think would be really interesting. The challenge here is that we need the expected VI or whatever metric that we're working with. We have to compute the expected VI, so we need some approximation of that. So yeah, we need some way to get approximation.
We're running into coffee break, but I think it's okay because it's a cool idea. We have another question here about Rex.
Yeah, very quick one. Thank you very much. I love the presentation and learning always about structures that are not in Euclidean space is nice, right? So this is just one of those examples. So I was wondering, probably I didn't get, but how is it you choose? You said we want in the wasabi estimate, we want L that is small. First idea that came to my head is like, well, you take the first maps, right? As you said, right? But then you show that it's not necessarily those. So how are you gonna pick those candidates for the wasabi estimations among this huge space? What is the rule you apply for that?
How do I initialize?
Yeah, how you initialize it? Or how are you summarizing these L candidates that you are putting in the wasabi?
Okay. Let me go back. Maybe that wasn't clear. Sorry, maybe I went too fast. So these are essentially like each of our MCMC samples. Each dot is an MCMC sample. And then we iterate between the two steps. So if we're given the particles, then we just assign each MCMC sample to its closest one. And then given each region of attraction, we can just, we can run some algorithms to find the min VI, the optimal particle. So it's this iterative algorithm that
you're using the kernel, right? In order to, I mean, you're using the actual the data to tell you where around. I mean, like that.
Yeah, this is agnostic to the model. So this is only based on the samples of the partitions themselves. So it's not based on the kernel of the mixture or anything. So it's not clear. Sorry.
Because not clear how you actually pick those ones. Because they are not ordered, right? This you can pick anybody in another area and put it in. They have no particular order in this unordered space. I don't know.
Samples of partitions to get a pairwise distance matrix.
I know. Yeah, it's like that's what I was saying. Just like using that, but how you pick those kind of put there space huge. Anyway, we can speak about that.
Yeah.
There's no more questions. Is it okay if we ask one more question? We go to that coffee break, or should we? Let's ask one more question. One more question. This is a very interesting and I think an important topic about clustering. And so one second, we'll go to coffee break after this.
Thank you very much. This is extremely interesting to me. I've been working on something very related. Actually, I'm working on trying to estimate the PSM without MCMC. And in one of the strategies I've been exploring, I split the space of partitions based on the cluster sizes because that's what's dominating in the prior, and then we have the likelihood contribution for the posterior, and that has to do with the cluster allocations themselves. So I was wondering if you could do something like this, you explore the space of partitions in parallel, you split the space based on the cluster sizes, and then you could, in the conjugate case, we can get a formula for some proportional to the posterior for each partition. And so we can use a greedy algorithm to find local modes within this, within each bin. And those could become your particles, for example. You don't need MCMC to explore the space of partitions. You just do it in this manner. And also, I agree that we could move through the space of partitions by just this split and merge steps, or just moving one item from one cluster to another. So in this way, again, we have an alternative to explore this space of partitions without MCMC.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe it's better to talk after, but I think it would be super interesting to try to find a way to get the approximation without doing MCMC. The issue is not exploring the space of partitions. I think the issue is more getting that estimate of the posterior expected VI distance.
Let's thank Sarah one more time for talking to me.